Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday Build. This is episode 1.43, and today we're going to be discussing the topic variable and user role build strategy in Gavel, featuring master variable lists, default values, and client portals. My name is Brittany Hernandez, and I am a lawyer, a professional no-code, low-code developer, a legal tech educator, and the global ambassador to law schools for Gavel. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic today because I think it's very important and something that a lot of people might not consider, especially when they're first using the tool. And that's specifically because you just don't know what variables are and how they work and how to use them when you're just starting out. And even when you've been doing it for a long time, you might do a good job kind of setting up your first couple of workflows, but then realize later how important it would have been for you to set this up correctly in the beginning. So I thought it might be good to just do a quick video and let you all know about how I think about variables, why I believe they're so important, and how I consider what role the user in particular is playing in each different workflow. And the user could be the paralegal, the user could be a lawyer, the user could be the end client, but also just thinking about the difference between the end user and the role of the contact or person that you have in your system, such as a client, for example. So we're going to go through all of these strategies and tips and all of these different concepts kind of in a more orderly fashion, because it might not be so obvious when we first start talking about it. So first of all, if you aren't familiar with Gavel, Gavel is a platform that allows you to create different automations, such as document automations, but also just automations that don't necessarily have an output document at the end. And it's usually around kind of the legal space, but can be used in different industries as well. So when we're talking about variable strategy, we're talking specifically about something that is called a variable that you will see connected to the different blocks within the workflows that you create. So we're talking, for example, here about this section. So when we are at our dashboards, depending on, what your level of, familiarity is with this tool, I'm assuming we're going to have people watching this who are a little bit earlier in their kind of journey with Gavel, because maybe you're trying it out for the first time, you're building your first workflow or your first set of workflows to put together in a bundle, for example. We're here at our dashboards, and we're going to be kind of just walking through how we would think about setting up a workflow and having that workflow kind of work within our overall strategy, and thinking about these different roles that our contact or client is playing, as well as our user roles. So in this particular example, let's say that we have this strategy that we want to have an initial client intake questionnaire that is filled out by the client while they're logged into their client portals. And then we want to be able to have, any subsequent workflows, either, something that we send as a link or have on our website for clients to use, or that we would push internally through the data manager as the lawyer, paralegal, or whatever member of the team. So in this one, let's think about how we would want to go about setting up that initial client workflow and how we would create the different variables for that. So let's say, for example, I have this initial consultation questionnaire where I'm just going to collect a little bit of information about someone before I meet with them to consult about their matter. So I might ask some questions around what type of matter do you need help with, and then for each of these, I would have a subsequent question of like which subtype. So let's say what type of matter would be something like copyright, trademark, entertainment, business. And then for each of those, a subcategory of things like contract reviews or general advice or contract drafting or whatever else. And then also when we a referral source, how did you hear about us, and so on. Maybe I'd also ask for things like their prefix, their first name, their last name, their middle name, etc. Things like their differentiating between like their legal name and then their preferred name. Things like pronouns. So if somebody has any preferred pronouns, how they like to be addressed in that way, what gender they were assigned at birth, and so on. So you're just collecting some general information about this person so that you can use this information kind of in future workflows, as well as just collecting it initially. So you have this in your CRM or your, let's say you use like a HubSpot or Clio Grow, or you use Clio Manage, or a combination of these tools. Now, when we're thinking about how we would actually build something like this initial consultation questionnaire, we want to think about that variable strategy. So the importance of variable strategy really comes down to data manager and data persistence. So when we're talking about data manager, we're talking about this feature here in Gavel in your dashboards that allows you to push or move information collected in previous workflows run and push them into other workflows. So let's say, for example, that I have this test initial consultation questionnaire that I've set up, and I want to find the one where it was, these are all just fake entries anyway. But just to say that, let's say I was going to try to find the one where it was Miss Alexander's middle name here. I could either just look for them, kind of in this manner, or I can search for them by using this filter function. So if user contains this value, or if first name is whatever, and something is the case, you can apply that and it will filter it down for you. In this particular case, I'm just going to use this one that I found here, and let's try to push that into another version of the workflow. Let's say this one here. So in that particular case, it's going to you see that it's already pushed us onto this next page because the previous page has already been completed. So you can see we're already on this next step. So whatever information hasn't been collected, you're going to have to put in, but any information that was already collected or that matches or is the same underlying variable as that particular first workflow that we're pushing from would be already filled out in the second one. So that has to do with that first data manager piece. The second piece is around data persistence, and this has to do with when someone is logged into their account when they're taking a workflow. So this would be something like an end user or client who has created a free user account on your particular Gavel subdomain. So let's say, for example, in this case, this person has created their user account. They're not a builder. They're not able to create any different workflows. They're not able to see kind of their data except for the sessions that they've particularly run. They can't see anyone else's. But they can access their bundles. They can see their assigned workflows. They can resume sessions and so on. They can view their past answers. For example, let me just see. I think this one I think I might have deleted. So anyway, let's try to find one that has something that would have answers. So like this, for example. So they're able to kind of go through, they could continue one of these and start from the beginning and so on. So what I'm saying here is that if you have someone logged into their account, then they're going to have all of the information that they've already previously entered in a prior workflow automatically filled out for them if the variables that are underlying are the same. So in this case, this person's already completed this information in the past. So they've already put in their first name, their middle name, and their last name in this kind of initial consultation questionnaire or some other workflow. So we wouldn't want to have them have to put in their information over and over and over again. And it can be kind of this beneficial thing for them to automatically generate or go through different workflows where all of these are going to be already filled out. So then they'd only need to focus on the parts that we need them to fill out that we don't have. And then, as I mentioned, there's just different strategies when it comes to this. So that's why we're talking about this kind of variable strategy piece. So one of the things that you can think of when you're creating these, so in this particular example where I'm asking for some initial details, is that I ask them this kind of breaking up into things like matter, and then I have things like contact. So who is the specific individual? You might have a separate one that's, let's say, you're talking to an individual, but the client that you're going to be working with is actually a company, you could ask for, some information around company. And what's helpful when you're trying to think about what to say for each of these, so because this could be, and like how to structure it, because you could have just had like first name, middle name, last name without denoting who specifically we're talking about for their first name, middle name, last name, and so on, is I like to do two things. One is I like to keep a master variable list of all the ones that I create. And I got this tip from, or I got this kind of practice from Tracy Troyer, who is very organized and good at this. But it's a way to make sure that if we already have a variable created in our master variable, like our initial consultation questionnaire or whatever else, we don't want to create another one that says like the same thing, like contact, but we're having it be first name like this instead of that. We need them to be consistent to benefit from that ability to utilize the data manager and utilize data persistence. So I like to keep track of which ones I've already created. And this is just a kind of a demo list. So you would have maybe more than these. So that you can always have you and your team referring to and using these same variables throughout your different workflows, depending on what role that contact is playing in that particular workflow. So in this particular case, when we're just collecting some initial information, we're collecting information about the main person that we would be interfacing with. Now, once you've completed that particular workflow, it might get confusing when you start to do things that have names like trust and trustee, grant and grantor, things like beneficiaries and heirs, and like all of these different specific names. So my thoughts about this, in the sense that like, okay, so it was easy to create something when you didn't have specific roles that people needed to fill. So what I like to do is, before you start automating a document, think about who is going to be completing the document, completing the workflow, like in what way. So for example, is this going to be something that you send a link to a client to fill out? Or is it something that you're going to be doing internally as a team, like as a team member or something, and then pushing some information from a past session into this particular one? So how is it structured? And I think that's going to change a little bit how you might structure something. But I think the variable strategy piece is going to be the same, because you're considering what role is my client playing, or the main contact that we have playing in this particular scenario. So in this particular example, let's say we have an anti-coercion insurance disclosure. We have things like lender name, borrower name, loan number, et cetera, name of signatory. So who is the signatory, and so on and so forth. So when you're thinking about how you would set up your workflows, would you necessarily like have it be that you would track these names right across into your variables? Some people might, like, let's say, for example, in this particular case, I have like lender name, license number, loan number, and it's going to pull exactly from here. What's difficult about this is that you wouldn't be benefiting from data persistence if the name of the borrower is the same as the name of your main contact that you usually deal with, that you're preparing this form for, or they're preparing it for themselves. Instead, you've kind of created this whole offshoot of a variable that doesn't fit within your overall strategy. So here, we'd have to still manually put in borrower name, and we wouldn't be able to pull from any information we already have, because we should instead use something like contact first name or contact full name, or whatever we've made that is how that person is going to play a role in this workflow. So if we are usually representing the lender, then maybe our main contact would have their company name or whatever be here, and have the borrower be something separate. So that's just to say, when you're creating these workflows, really think about having this kind of master variable list that you really refer back to and that you use consistently in your workflows, knowing who is working in what capacity. If your focus is helping, someone who is creating this from the bar's perspective, then I would suggest changing this to contact full name, and then having that be, in my case, what I like to do with these as well is to create the combinations of separate pieces of data in the using invisible logic. So that's just to say, like, for example, in this one, let me find the silver one. What I have is set up some invisible logic where I have different variations of somebody's name. So I can have things like contact full name, first and last, no middle, contact full name, first, middle, initial, and last, contact full name with the first, full, middle, full name, first, full, middle, and last, and this one has the middle, initial, and so on and so forth. So you're kind of breaking up how these different ones look, and then adding invisible logic for one that says, like, for example, that I just want if they have a middle name or they don't have a middle name. So that's how you can kind of break these out when you're only asking someone in their questions, what's their prefix, what's their first name, middle name, and last name, and you make all those combinations in the back end using invisible logic. And you can take that variable that you created in invisible logic and use that one in these future workflows. So that's just to say you wouldn't have to put first name, middle name, last name, and then make invisible logic and so on and so on. If you're putting this through as the full name of the borrower, maybe in some particular format, you would just use whatever one you created for that format that you need here in this variable name. So let's say, for example, if we're using this case, maybe we would use something like, let's say like their, let's go back to where I was here. Maybe we would do something like their full first name, full middle name, and their last name, for example. So that's just to say, like, when we are creating these, we wouldn't always want to approach it from having each of these be borrower name, lender name, trustee, trustor, grantee, grantor, because you would want to be able to identify who do we already have information about because they've filled something out before, or who's going to play that role that we represent normally, so that we can have that benefit of the data manager and data persistence. So I know this is a lot to digest at once, but just to kind of show you behind the scenes how I usually like to think about variables, think about variable strategy. And then somebody might wonder, what if I've already set up a bunch of different workflows and now we're kind of seeing this video and like, oh no, like we don't have to redo everything? Because if you did already go through and create a bunch of workflows like this, and you've already tagged your output documents to have it look like this and behave having this particular variable, if you change the variable name here, you'd have to also change it in the output document as well. So one of the reasons why on my first slide here, I said we would be featuring master variable lists, which we've already looked at here, default values in client portals, which we've already seen client portals now as well, is default values can be helpful in certain circumstances when you've already done a lot of work on the front end. It's not going to work for like every single case, but I'm just going to show you an example in case it's helpful, because it was helpful in a particular situation that I had with a client where they had already created a bunch of these different workflows and then later wanted to have this process of having a variable strategy where everything was collected in the initial consultation or intake form, and then that information was used to populate other documents using the data manager to push information from one to another. So let's say that right now we have this document set up that we have the questions around the lender's name, the license number, the loan number, the statute or code, and the property address. And also sometimes maybe a person is playing more than one role in this particular one. So in that case, I'll show you how to do this as well. So let's say, for example, that the name of the borrower is going to be the actual one that we already know, which is a client's full name. If you go under settings, you can actually use this kind of call sign for variables within the default value. So here we have the $sign and then an open curly bracket. You put the variable name here in the middle, and then you have a closed curly bracket here. So let's say, for example, we want to have our client who filled out an initial consultation questionnaire at some point pushed into this next one. So let me find one that's like mostly filled out. I think maybe this one would be good. So what we would want to do is see what is our variable name that we used for our initial consultation questionnaire that we want to then be pushed into this particular one. So if I find that one that we were looking at again, that we would then be pushing, is we would look for that contact full name variable that we want. Let's say we want the one that is like their first, full, middle, and last. So their full name, for example, then we would put that one right into here. And let's go ahead and save this. So now when we push this information, and don't worry about this if this is one of the things that's going to happen is like, it's going to say like, we don't know where this variable is coming from. So it's not in your workflow. It's not asking any questions. So if you run it, let's say that I'm just going to put like a couple of things here to get this to move on. It's going to look like this. But if you instead push this information from the data manager, like here, for example, into this one that we're trying to use. So let's use, sorry, this is going to be the anti-disclosure agreement. When we push this, then we're going to be able to see that it's going to, let's just push it, put in client's middle name. So the one that we pushed from here and took from here is going to populate into our particular workflow where we have client's middle name as their full name. The combination of the different variables like first, middle name, last name, etc. And then we'll be able to just automatically use that from using the default value. One of the other things I was mentioning is what if the person is playing, like that contact, for example, is playing more than one role within the same workflow? Then what you would do, and even if you didn't have this being pushed and you just had, let's say, you wanted to separate out like borrower and signatory and so on, but the signatory and the borrower are the same person, then what you could do is have the borrower name be the default value for the name of the signatory. So for example, you would pull this information here, and you wouldn't be able to use the same variable like borrower name here because you've already used it and you need every one of them to be unique in this particular case. So let's say, for example, we continue next, then it would be this kind of, let me just go back to where we were here. Then this name of the signatory is also going to be pre-populated and filled out for you as well. So that's the power of default values to kind of get around a little bit this limitation of having only one variable per block. But when you're using the same information about somebody who's already before it, so I mean, like if the borrower is also the signatory and you want to set this up to have different names and variables for each of these, then you can assign this role for this person by using the default value. Now, this is not something that I would highly recommend. I wouldn't highly recommend this as like a default strategy because there are some limitations in that if you've already collected some information that came from like a single select or multi-select, things like that, which I usually run into when it comes down to things like gender and things like that. When you're trying to, it's harder to create a default value for those that it's pulling information from another place. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we take something like a single select and we create, it doesn't matter what it is, it's just to show you the settings. You're not going to be able to type in the default value. So you might want to consider that you wouldn't have as much control over these types of blocks. So it's not something you want to, as I mentioned, really rely on, but it is something that you could consider having be a workaround if you've already set up a bunch of different workflows and you kind of went through and you notice that you really need that contact, that main contact, to push into borrower name and signatory, for example. And this is kind of one of those workarounds. For those ones that are like a single select and stuff like that, and you're still trying to have all that information populate from a previous workflow with all the variables that are underlying, what you would need to do is to change that variable. Let's go back to this example here. So let's say you have it like this. You would want to change this variable name to whichever one you want to push in. Let's say like contact, something like contact, like maybe gender or something like gender assigned at birth or something like that. And then you would need to make sure that you update the output document as well, because if you already have, whatever it was before inside the document and then you take it out, it's not going to recognize it anymore and you're going to get an error. So those are the different kinds of things you want to think about when you're trying to set up your workflows and how you can consider variables, user roles, and so on when you're building out your workflows. Now, one thing that I think would be helpful to point out as well is the usefulness of referring to things that do this all the time. So to get like hints about good ways to do this. So for example, if you look at like HubSpot, or if you look at Clio, for example, you're going to see that this is their default way of creating variables. Let me just go ahead and quickly sign into here. This is just a demo account. Anyway, it's not going to have any real client information or anything. So we'll just quickly log in here just to show you that, for example, the underlying, I think they call them properties or field properties or something like that. They already have a lot that are already built in, view all properties, and then you can manage these properties and see like what they're called. So we have things like annual revenue and so on and so forth. They have like field types and basic like different rules and whatever else, but you can kind of get a sense of like what these are called. So like, let's say, I think these might be ones that, yeah. So you have like first name, preferred first name, last name, or surname if you are in a country that that uses surname instead. So you can get kind of a sense of what these are called, and you can see that these are broken up into contacts, companies. So these are kind of like the two bigger groups of people that you would group into. Contacts and companies, and then those contacts and companies can play several different roles throughout different kind of pieces of this and put in, like, let's say, as used as personalized tokens and emails and things like that. So we can just get some clues by looking at the properties that are created by default in things like a CRM, or in this particular case, if I use Clio as an example, you're going to see how it's managed there, just to get some ideas for how we might want to set it up and break things up. So they break things up into like contacts, and between contacts, they have people and companies, and then they have like matters. So you can kind of start to get a sense of how these all break down. And if we go into contacts and we look into, let's say, a particular person, we can go into see that they have things like prefix, first name, middle name, last name, company, title, date of birth, email address, etc., etc., etc. But you can kind of start to see that breakdown of how information is collected about a person in these kind of different systems. And then you can customize this to work for your particular use cases. I in particular like to be general but specific, in the sense that you have something general enough that it can encompass things that would span multiple different workflows. So contact would be something that maybe in some cases they're the client, maybe some cases they are the, maybe they're playing different roles. So like they are the borrower in one particular workflow, they're a signatory in another, a trustee or a grantee in another workflow, et cetera, et cetera. But this contact kind of more general term is going to apply to all of those situations. And then specific enough to say, I want that person's first name and that person's middle name and that person's last name and so on. So that's how we can be general and specific enough to apply to multiple different circumstances. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about things like master variable lists, how we can harness the power of default values, but being aware that you don't want it to be your go-to default strategy. I'd rather you set these up in your workflows initially properly rather than having to kind of put a band-aid on it later, because it's also going to limit how you can present this, because like I said, when we do it without having pushed the information, it's going to say like unknown variable. And so somebody would have to highlight it and change it unless you were pushing this internally. Or if somebody was logged in when they were taking this and that underlying variable was already filled out in the past. So it's going to limit how you can use that particular workflow if you're having to rely on default values as a band-aid. In the particular circumstance that we used it in, it was helpful because it was always going to be the case that that workflow was going to be used internally and pushed from the data manager. So it can be helpful to save a lot of work of redoing and retagging long documents and workflows. So it's one thing that you can try if you're kind of already far down the road and you need to just find a patch for it right now. We talked about a little bit of client portals and how they can be useful in making sure that you're benefiting from data persistence, where if the person is logged in when they take that initial client intake questionnaire, for example, anytime they're putting in data that's going to be used in multiple places and multiple times in the future by that same client, you should have them logged in. And I think the best place to do this is in the beginning. So whenever you're taking like their information as an initial client intake or initial consultation or anything like that, I would highly encourage you to have them before they're meeting with you or before they fill that out. They need to create a free account on your subdomain and be logged in when they take that particular workflow. And you can control whether they are forced to log in or not by using the kind of permissions and access features within your workflow. So if you go into anyone, you can see that we go into settings, and under settings, we're going to be able to make it to where we have access permissions. And this makes it to where you can, similar to things like Google Drive or whatever else, you can make a particular workflow publicly accessible. So meaning that nobody has to log in. But if you have this one clicked, only logged in users, you can say only logged in users and do nothing else. And then it will make it to where when somebody has that link and you give it to them, they're prompted to log in before they can access it. So I would highly recommend this for things like your client intake questionnaires or any type of initial consultation or anywhere where you're collecting a lot of information that's going to be used multiple times. And then you can also limit it to things like allow each user to complete this workflow only once, allow specific email domains, allow specific email addresses, and so on and so forth. That's more probably going to be around like if you only want certain people to access it, and less around like if you want them to be logged in to benefit from data persistence, but just so you know that those options are available to you. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we're thinking about all of these different strategies. And these are just a few tips to keep you in thinking about how you might go about structuring your workflows, especially from the beginning, especially if you're new to Gavel and you're doing these for the first time. You can think long-term about the benefits of having a standardized system of how you create variables and how you use them across multiple workflows. So definitely something to think about when we think about having a master variable list, utilizing default values if you have that user playing multiple roles within a single workflow, client portals, and so on. So This has been an episode of the Wednesday Build, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to go through just a few announcements and then we'll wrap up. So I have new episodes of this show live every Wednesday. You're welcome to join me again next week. I also have a new issue of Code Word Hex out every Tuesday, which is kind of similar to this, but goes more into how to specifically do something. So how to create a workflow that's doing this type of thing, or much more like tutorial based. And then I also have a free weekly newsletter called the Tuesday Forecast, which is just a weekly free newsletter that lets you know about some different community events going on. I also have certification courses in Gavel at the basic, silver, gold, and gold test out levels. We have a new cohort starting tomorrow, Thursday, October 26th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. You're welcome to join us. And that's going to be starting and kicking off the full certification series, which is 4 weeks long. And then we have a break before we start the next cohort. I also have courses in software and Airtable with the certification course and Go full page and more to come. And if you'd like to join our community, Chromium Global, just join any of these different ones on our website at chromiumacademy.com, and you'll be added to that. And we do have for the Gavel community an active Slack group if you want to join us there as well. So thank you so much for being here. For those of you that are with me live and those of you that are on the recording, hello. We're going to meet again next Wednesday, the 1st of November at 10 a.m. Pacific time, which is the day before my birthday. My birthday is November 2nd, so I'm excited. And we're going to be discussing the topic, don't just set it and forget it, navigating setup and maintenance considerations in automation. So this one's really important because I have seen in the past things be set up incorrectly from the beginning, and then that mistake gets perpetuated every time because you just like, oh, I automated it once, and then you just don't think about it anymore. So this is one way that we can kind of think about a long-term strategy, as well as kind of thinking about the end from the beginning and always making sure that we're just checking our work and not just setting it and forgetting it. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or via email at brittany@chromium.pro. And since I do represent Gavel as well for their law school program, if you'd like to reach out to me about that program, you can email me at brittany@gavel.io. So that is all for today, and I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.